I handed my 3-month-old daughter to her grandmother for just 10 minutes. What happened next still haunts my nightmares, because it revealed the monster hiding in plain sight and tore my entire world apart. That day, I believed I was just stepping away to warm a bottle. I believed my baby, my sweet Grace, was safe. But when I walked back into that living room just 10 minutes later, I couldn't breathe. My daughter was screaming. A sound I'd never heard, primal and raw, her tiny face covered in angry red marks. And there, standing calmly, was my mother-in-law, Patricia, smoothing her expensive suit. She just wouldn't stop crying, she said, her voice chillingly even. So I had to teach her a lesson. My sister-in-law, Veronica, was on her phone, actually laughing. And then my husband, Marcus, appeared in the doorway. He saw it all. He saw Grace, he saw his mother, he saw the horror on my face. And he did nothing. Instead, he just said, "Don't overreact, Charlotte. She's fine." Fine. My baby was not fine. I snatched Grace from Patricia's arms, my own body shaking with a rage so potent it felt like fire. Her little body trembled against me, covered in red fingerprints, bruises already blooming on her delicate skin. I raced her to the emergency room, my heart hammering against my ribs. And when the doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Chun, examined Grace, her face went white. She gasped, actually stepped back and shouted, "Notify the authorities immediately. I'm Charlotte. And this is the story of how I lost everything I thought was my life, only to discover I've been living a nightmare disguised as a dream." It started on an ordinary Thursday, not with a bang, but with a seemingly innocent call. My daughter, Grace, was only 3 months old. Those first weeks of new motherhood were a blur of exhaustion, a constant cycle of feeding and sleepless nights, but I loved every single second with my tiny girl. She had these bright hazel eyes that just seemed to look right into my soul, and her smile lit up my entire world. My husband, Marcus, and I had been married for 4 years. We met in college at Michigan State. He came from money, the kind of old Detroit money that builds wings on hospitals and has streets named after your ancestors. His mother, Patricia, made sure everyone knew about their prominence. She wore her status like armor, and from the moment Marcus introduced us, I could tell she thought I wasn't good enough for her precious son. Patricia had opinions about everything. My clothes were too casual. My graphic design career was cute, but not serious. My family, who ran a small bakery in Ann Arbor, lacked sophistication. She never said these things directly, no, her comments always came wrapped in sugar, but with a sting so sharp you felt it deep down. Marcus would always laugh it off, telling me his mother was just old-fashioned, that she'd warm up eventually. I wanted to believe him. I loved him. And when you're in love, you tend to overlook red flags the size of billboards. When I got pregnant, Patricia's behavior shifted. Suddenly, I was worthy of her attention because I was carrying her grandchild. She called daily with unsolicited advice, showed up unannounced with bags full of designer baby clothes, and started making plans for Grace's future before she was even born. Marcus thought it was sweet. I felt suffocated. But I kept quiet, thinking enduring her intrusions was better than making waves. Oh, how wrong I was. The day everything fell apart, Patricia had called that morning, insisting she needed to see Grace. She claimed it had been too long, even though she'd been at our house just 3 days prior. Marcus, ever the peacemaker, encouraged me to let her come over, saying his mother just wanted to bond. Against my better judgment, I agreed. His sister, Veronica, would be coming too, which in hindsight should have been my first chilling warning. Veronica was 31, 2 years older than Marcus, and perpetually bitter about her own messy divorce. She seemed to take pleasure in other people's misery. She and Patricia had this strange, almost mean girl relationship, always whispering and giggling at someone else's expense. I'd been the target of their jokes before, overhearing comments about my postpartum body or my struggles with breastfeeding. Marcus, of course, told me I was being sensitive. They arrived around 2 in the afternoon. Patricia swept in, a vision in a cream pantsuit that probably cost more than my car, immediately reaching for Grace without even asking. I'd been holding my daughter, cherishing a rare quiet moment where she wasn't fussy, but Patricia plucked her from my arms like I was just the hired help. "Let Grandma have her precious angel," she cooed, already walking towards the living room. Veronica followed, barely acknowledging me, lost in her phone. I stood in the foyer, feeling utterly dismissed in my own home. It was a familiar, uncomfortable feeling. After about 20 minutes, Grace started fussing. She was due for a feeding, and I knew that particular cry. My mother's instinct kicked in. I moved to take her back, but Patricia waved me off with an irritated gesture. "I can handle a crying baby, Charlotte. I raised 2 children, remember? Go warm her bottle or whatever you need to do. We're fine here." Something twisted in my stomach. A primal instinct screamed at me, "Don't leave her alone with them." But I pushed it down. I told myself I was being paranoid, overprotective. These were Marcus's family, Grace's grandmother and aunt. What could possibly happen in the 10 minutes it would take me to prepare a bottle? I walked to the kitchen just down the hall from the living room. Our house had an open floor plan, but you couldn't quite see into the living room from the counter where I stood. I could hear Grace's cries escalating, that particular pitch that meant she was truly upset now. I worked quickly, testing the formula temperature on my wrist just like the pediatrician had shown me. That's when I heard it. A sharp, distinct smacking sound, followed by Grace's scream. Not her normal cry. Something raw. Something terrified. It shot ice through my veins. I dropped the bottle on the counter and ran. The scene in the living room didn't make sense at first. My brain literally couldn't process what my eyes were showing me. Grace was in Patricia's arms, her tiny face beet red, covered in angry welts across both cheeks. Tears streamed down her face as she shrieked in a way I never want to hear again. A sound of pure terror and pain. And Patricia? She just stood there with this calm, almost satisfied expression, like she just accomplished some necessary mundane task. What did you do? The words came out strangled, barely a whisper. I lunged forward, snatching Grace from Patricia's arms, cradling my baby against my chest. Grace's little body trembled as she sobbed, and then I saw more. Red fingerprints, fresh bruises already forming on her delicate arms. She wouldn't stop crying, Patricia said matter-of-factly, smoothing down her pantsuit as if we were discussing the weather. Sometimes babies need to learn that throwing fits won't get them what they want. I had to teach her. Veronica was still on the couch, actually laughing at something on her phone, completely indifferent to Grace's screams. She glanced up briefly when I started shouting. Teach her. She's 3 months old. What is wrong with you? I was shaking now, rage and horror mixing into something volcanic. Then I heard footsteps. Marcus appeared in the doorway. Relief, blinding and overwhelming, flooded through me. He'd make this right. He'd see what his mother had done, and he'd lose his mind. But Marcus just stood there. His face was pale, his hands in his pockets. He looked at Grace's red, tear-stained face with something that looked like annoyance. What's going on? He asked, even though he must have heard everything. Your mother hit our baby. Look at her face. I held Grace out slightly so he could see the marks clearly. Marcus glanced at his mother, who gave him some look I couldn't decipher. Then he turned back to me, his eyes full of exasperation. Don't overreact, Charlotte. She's fine. Babies cry. My mom knows what she's doing. The floor fell out from under me. This man, the man I married, the man I trusted, the man I built a life with, was looking at our injured infant and telling me I was overreacting. And in the doorway behind him I could see he'd been standing there. He'd seen what happened. He'd watched his mother hurt our child. And he had done nothing. She's not fine. My voice cracked. Look at her. Patricia stepped closer, her voice dripping with condescension. You're being hysterical. I gave her a little tap to stop the crying. That's what parents did in my generation, and we all turned out just fine. You millennials cuddle children and create weak adults. Get out, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Get out of my house right now. Charlotte, calm down, Marcus started. But I cut him off. No. Your mother assaulted our baby, and you're defending her. Both of you need to leave. Veronica finally looked up from her phone, rolling her eyes. God, you're so dramatic. It's a few red marks. They'll fade. I couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, and all I could think about was getting Grace somewhere safe. I grabbed my purse from the entry table, still holding my screaming baby, and headed for the door. Where are you going? Marcus called after me. Hospital. And then probably the police. You're going to call the cops on my mother over this? Marcus's voice rose in disbelief. I turned to look at him, this stranger wearing my husband's face. Yes. The drive to the emergency room was the longest 15 minutes of my life. Grace wouldn't stop crying, and I kept looking at her in the rearview mirror, terror clawing at my throat. What if Patricia had hurt her worse than I could see? What if there was internal damage? My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The ER staff took us back immediately. A nurse with kind eyes gently took Grace from my arms. Dr. Samantha Chun appeared within minutes. She was young, probably close to my age, and she examined Grace thoroughly while I stood there, feeling like I might shatter into a million pieces. The examination felt like hours. And then when Dr. Chun finally looked at me, her expression made my blood run cold. She gasped, actually stepped backward, her professional composure cracking. Notify the authorities immediately, she said to the nurse, her voice sharp, urgent. Then she turned to me, her eyes full of something between pity and horror. Mrs. Patterson, these aren't just marks from slapping. These are burn marks. The room spun. What? Your daughter has first and second-degree burns on her face and arms. The pattern suggests cigarettes. Multiple cigarettes. I thought I might vomit. My legs gave out, and I sank into the plastic chair behind me. No, that's not possible. I was only gone 10 minutes. She was crying and Patricia said she had to teach her, but I didn't see any cigarettes. I would have smelled smoke. Dr. Chan knelt in front of me, her hand on my knee. How long were you out of the room? 10 minutes, maybe less. I went to get her bottle. Someone burned your baby, Mrs. Patterson. Multiple times. This is severe abuse, and I'm legally required to report it. The police are already on their way. If you're still with me and finding this as unbelievable as I did, please consider hitting that subscribe button. There are more stories of unbelievable betrayals and unexpected strength coming your way. Everything after that happened in fragments. Police officers asking me the same questions over and over. A detective named Sarah Montgomery, with tired eyes and a gentle voice, taking my statement. Social services getting involved. Grace being admitted overnight for observation. Me sitting in that uncomfortable hospital chair while they treated my baby's burns. Unable to process that this was actually happening. Marcus showed up around 7 that evening. He called my phone 37 times, but I turned it off after the first dozen. He found me in Grace's hospital room, where she finally slept fitfully in the plastic bassinet, bandages on her tiny face. Charlotte, we need to talk about this, he said, his voice low and urgent. I looked up at him and I barely recognized this person. About what? About how your mother tortured our infant daughter. About how you saw it happening and did nothing. He ran his hand through his sandy hair. A nervous gesture I used to find endearing. You're blowing this way out of proportion. My mom made a mistake. She feels terrible. She burned Grace with cigarettes, Marcus. Multiple cigarettes. While your sister sat there on her phone laughing, while you stood in that doorway and watched. His face flushed red. I didn't see anything. I just heard crying. When I came in, you were already freaking out. Liar. The word came out flat, certain. You were standing right there. I saw you. The police want to talk to my mother, he said, changing tactics. You need to tell them this was all a misunderstanding. That Grace maybe had an allergic reaction or something. I stood up slowly, keeping my voice quiet so I wouldn't wake Grace. Are you actually asking me to lie to the police about who hurt our baby? I'm asking you to think about our family, about what this will do to us, to my mother's reputation. She's on the board of 3 charities. This kind of scandal could destroy her. She could have killed Grace. Marcus's jaw clenched. You're being hysterical. My mother would never actually hurt a baby. Maybe she was a little rough, but you're making this into something it's not. Get out, I said quietly. Charlotte, get out before I call security. You made your choice. You chose your mother over our daughter. I'll never forgive you for that. He left, but not before telling me I'd regret this, that I was tearing apart our family over nothing. I sat back down next to Grace's bassinet, watching her chest rise and fall, and cried until I had nothing left. The investigation moved quickly. Dr. Chen's report was damning, and the photographic evidence of Grace's injuries was irrefutable. Patricia was arrested the next morning. Veronica was brought in for questioning as a witness, but claimed she'd been so absorbed in her phone she hadn't noticed anything unusual. But the text message records pulled from her phone told a very different story. She'd been texting her friend Karen throughout the incident, messages that said things like, OMG, Patricia is going full psycho on the baby, and this is insane. I should film this. She'd watched her mother burn my baby with cigarettes and thought it was entertainment. Marcus hired an expensive lawyer for Patricia within hours of her arrest. He also filed for emergency custody of Grace, claiming I was an unfit mother who'd made false allegations to alienate his family. The sheer audacity of it stole my breath. I hired my own lawyer, a fierce woman named Diana Pratt, who specialized in family law. She took one look at the hospital records and promised me she'd make sure Marcus never got unsupervised access to Grace again. The next few months were hell. Patricia was charged with aggravated child abuse and assault. Marcus filed for divorce, and the custody battle turned vicious. His family's money meant he could afford to drag things out, filing motion after motion, trying to paint me as unstable and vindictive. His lawyer argued that I'd somehow caused Grace's injuries myself and blamed Patricia. They brought in expert witnesses who suggested the burns could have been accidental. That maybe I'd spilled hot coffee on her or left her too close to a space heater. During this nightmare, I discovered just how calculated Marcus's family truly was. His father, Gerald Patterson, was a corporate attorney who'd built his career on crushing opponents. He personally oversaw the strategy to destroy my credibility, hiring private investigators to dig through my entire life, searching for anything they could weaponize. They found my college roommate, who remembered me getting drunk at a party once. They contacted my high school boyfriend, who claimed I'd been emotionally unstable after our breakup when I was 17. They even tracked down a professor who'd given me a C- on a paper freshman year, trying to establish a pattern of me being unable to handle criticism. These investigators followed me everywhere. I'd see the same car parked outside my parents' bakery, the same man in sunglasses at the grocery store. They photographed me looking exhausted, catching me on days when I hadn't showered or when I'd been crying. These photos were submitted to the court as evidence that I was neglecting my appearance and therefore, probably neglecting Grace. My lawyer Diana was furious, filing harassment complaints, but the damage was already done. Marcus's legal team subpoenaed my medical records, finding a therapy session from 2 years before Grace was born where I'd mentioned feeling overwhelmed at work. They twisted this into evidence of long-term mental health issues. They demanded my phone records, my social media passwords, access to my email accounts. Every private moment, every vulnerable confession to friends, every human emotion I'd ever expressed was picked apart and presented as proof that I was unfit. The financial pressure was crushing. Diana was expensive. My parents took out a second mortgage on the bakery to help me. I had to sell my car and drive my dad's old pickup truck. Grace needed specialized cream for her burns that insurance only partially covered. I was working whatever design jobs I could get, while spending hours every day dealing with legal paperwork, court dates and depositions. Marcus, meanwhile, showed up to court in $1,000 suits, his parents flanking him like royalty. The optics were terrible. He looked stable and successful. I looked haggard and desperate. His mother, Patricia, sat in the defendant's chair during her preliminary hearings, looking like somebody's sweet grandmother, dressed in soft pastels, her silver hair perfectly styled. She dabbed at her eyes with tissues, playing the role of wrongly accused victim so convincingly that I watched jurors' expressions soften with sympathy. The worst part was how the Patterson family tried to turn my own parents against me. Gerald approached my father outside the courthouse one day, suggesting that if I dropped the charges and agreed to shared custody, they'd make sure my family was taken care of. When my dad refused suddenly, the health inspector was showing up at the bakery every other week, finding violations that had never been issues before. The city threatened to revoke their business license over paperwork technicalities that appeared out of nowhere. My mother received anonymous letters calling me a liar and threatening violence. Someone vandalized my parents' car, spray painting "liar" across the hood. The police investigated but could never prove who'd done it, though I had my suspicions. The Pattersons had connections throughout Detroit, people who owed them favors, people who could make problems appear and disappear. Through all of this, I had to maintain perfect composure during custody evaluations. A court-appointed psychologist named Dr. Frank Morrison came to my parents' house, where Grace and I were living, to observe our interactions. He was a stern man who'd clearly seen too many custody battles. He watched me feed Grace, watched me change her diaper, asked me questions about my parenting philosophy, while taking notes on a yellow legal pad that made scratching sounds that set my teeth on edge. Every movement felt scrutinized. Was I holding Grace correctly? Was I being too anxious? Not anxious enough? Dr. Morrison asked about my relationship with Marcus, my childhood, my feelings toward Patricia. I answered carefully, trying to sound rational and measured while describing the woman who tortured my infant daughter. He revealed nothing through his expression, just kept writing those infuriating notes. The evaluation report took 6 weeks. During that time, Marcus was granted supervised visitation at a neutral facility. I had to bring Grace to this depressing building with beige walls and cheap plastic toys, hand her over to Marcus while a social worker watched, then sit in the parking lot for 2 hours, imagining worst-case scenarios. What if he ran with her? What if the social worker wasn't paying attention? What if something happened? Grace would come back from these visits clingy and upset, taking hours to settle down. She was too young to tell me what was wrong, but I could see the anxiety in her little body. Marcus complained to the court that I was poisoning her against him, that my obvious hostility during exchanges was traumatizing her. He requested makeup time, additional visits, unsupervised access. Each request sent me into a panic spiral that I had to hide from everyone around me. Diana prepared me for Patricia's trial with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign. We spent hours going over my testimony, anticipating every question the defense might ask, every way they might try to trip me up or make me look unreliable. She even brought in a consultant who had worked with the FBI to help me understand how defense attorneys manipulate witnesses. They're going to try to make you angry. The consultant, a woman named Teresa Banks, told me. They'll imply you're a bad mother, that you caused the injuries, that you're lying for attention or revenge. Your job is to stay calm, stick to the facts, and never let them see you lose control. But how do you stay calm when someone is calling you a liar about your baby being burned? How do you maintain composure when they're suggesting you're mentally ill? Twisting your words, defending the monster who hurt your child. We practiced for weeks. Diana would play the defense attorney, throwing horrible questions at me while Teresa critiqued my body language and tone. Don't cross your arms. It looks defensive. Don't look at the jury when you answer. Look at the attorney. Pause before responding. It makes you seem thoughtful rather than rehearsed. If you need to cry, cry, but don't let it become hysterical. I felt like I was preparing for battle, which I suppose I was. This trial would determine whether Patricia faced real consequences or walked away. If she got off lightly, Marcus would use it as ammunition in the custody fight. Proof that the allegations were exaggerated. The preliminary hearings were brutal. Patricia's attorney, a shark named Ronald Mann, filed motion after motion to suppress evidence. He argued that Veronica's text messages should be excluded. He tried to prevent Dr. Chun from testifying. He even attempted to have the photographs of Grace's burns deemed too prejudicial to show the jury. Diana fought every motion, but we lost some battles. The judge ruled that certain statements I'd made to police immediately after the incident couldn't be used because I'd been too emotionally distraught for them to be considered reliable. Never mind that I'd been distraught because my baby had just been tortured. Apparently, extreme distress makes you less credible, not more. Through all of this, I watched Marcus transform into someone I'd never truly known. Or maybe he'd always been this person, and I'd been too in love to see it clearly. He gave an interview to a local news station, carefully chosen for their sympathetic coverage of white defendants, where he played the role of the devastated son standing by his wrongly accused mother. "My wife has struggled since our daughter was born," he told the camera, his voice dripping with false concern. "I think she may have postpartum depression, and instead of getting help, she's created this elaborate story to explain away an accident. I love Charlotte, but she needs professional help, and my mother has become the scapegoat for her struggles." The interviewer, a blonde woman with too much hairspray, nodded along sympathetically. "It must be difficult to be caught between your mother and your wife." "It's destroying our family," Marcus agreed. I threw a coffee mug at the television screen when I heard him say it. My mother came running, finding me on the floor surrounded by glass shards, crying so hard I couldn't breathe. But the evidence was overwhelming. The pattern of the burns, the placement, Grace's age, the timeline of events. Dr. Chun testified about the impossibility of the injuries being accidental. The text messages from Veronica, even though she tried to claim they were jokes, supported my version of events. The fact that Marcus had been in the doorway, that he tried to convince me not to report it, made him look complicit. Patricia's trial took place the following spring. I had to testify, had to sit in that courtroom, and relive the worst day of my life while Patricia sat at the defense table looking dignified and wronged. Her lawyer painted me as a young mother suffering from postpartum depression, who had hallucinated the entire event. They brought up every time I'd express frustration with motherhood on social media, every text where I complained about being tired, every moment of normal human struggle, and twisted it into evidence of mental instability. But the jury saw through it. They deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Patricia guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in prison, calling her actions unconscionable and a betrayal of the most fundamental human responsibility. I watched Marcus's face crumble as his mother was led away in handcuffs, and I felt nothing but cold, hard satisfaction. The divorce was finalized shortly after. I got full custody of Grace, with Marcus receiving only supervised visitation, though he rarely used it. He blamed me for everything, for destroying his mother's life, for ruining his family's reputation. The last thing he said to me was that I'd pay for what I'd done. Rebuilding my life took time. I moved back to Ann Arbor, close to my parents and the bakery where I'd grown up. My mom and dad were my lifeline during those dark months, helping with Grace, making sure I ate and slept and didn't disappear into the trauma. Grace recovered physically, though the scars on her face took months to fade. I worried constantly about psychological damage, about what those minutes of terror might have done to her developing brain. But her pediatrician assured me that at 3 months old, she likely wouldn't retain conscious memory of the event. The first year after everything fell apart was pure survival mode. I lived in my childhood bedroom with Grace's crib squeezed into the corner, surrounded by the posters and books from my teenage years. Being 28 and back in my parents' house felt like failure, even though rationally I knew I was doing what needed to be done. My mom would come wake me for Grace's night feedings because I'd sleep through her cries, my body so exhausted from stress that it shut down completely. My parents never complained, never made me feel like a burden, but I felt it anyway. I heard my dad on the phone with the bank discussing payment plans for the mortgage they'd taken out to help with my legal fees. I saw my mother's hands shaking as she filled out paperwork for yet another health inspection at the bakery, the third one that month. The Pattersons might be facing justice, but they'd managed to hurt everyone I loved in the process. Getting back into graphic design work was harder than I expected. My portfolio was outdated, my skills rusty from months of focusing solely on legal battles and keeping Grace alive. I took on small projects, logo designs for local businesses, website updates for family friends. The money was minimal, barely enough to cover Grace's medical expenses and co-pays for my therapy appointments. I started therapy with Dr. Helen Ortega, a trauma specialist who'd worked with abuse survivors for 20 years. Her office was calming, full of plants and soft lighting. The first few sessions I couldn't talk without crying. I'd sit on her beige couch with tissues wadded in my fists, trying to explain the guilt that ate at me constantly. I left her alone with them. I told Dr. Ortega during our 4th session. I knew something felt wrong. My instincts were screaming at me, and I ignored them because I didn't want to seem paranoid or overprotective. Dr. Ortega leaned forward, her dark eyes compassionate behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Charlotte, you left your baby with her grandmother for 10 minutes to prepare a bottle. That's not neglect. That's normal parenting. You couldn't have predicted what Patricia would do, because normal people don't burn infants with cigarettes." But logic didn't touch the guilt. It lived in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold, reminding me constantly that I'd failed to protect Grace when she needed me most. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning in a panic, rushing to her crib to make sure she was breathing, that she was safe, that no one had somehow gotten into the house to hurt her again. The nightmares were relentless. I walked back into that living room over and over. But in the dreams I was always too late. Grace would be silent and still, and Patricia would be smiling. Or Marcus would be there, holding her, walking away while I screamed and couldn't move. Or the room would be on fire, and I couldn't reach her through the flames. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, and have to physically touch Grace to convince myself she was real and safe. Dr. Ortega diagnosed me with PTSD, and started me on medication to help with the anxiety and intrusive thoughts. The pills made me foggy at first, but eventually they took the edge off the constant panic. I could function, could focus on Grace instead of being paralyzed by fear every moment. Still, I watched her obsessively for signs of problems. Every cry sent me into panic mode, analyzing the pitch and duration, trying to determine if it was normal baby fussiness, or something more sinister. Was she crying more than other babies? Was she bonding with me properly? Would what happened to her cause developmental delays or attachment issues? Her pediatrician, Dr. Nathan Brooks, was patient with my anxieties. He understood why I called his office 3 times a week. "Grace is thriving," he told me at her 6-month checkup. "She's hitting all her milestones. She's social, responsive, and clearly bonded with you. What happened to her was horrific, Charlotte, but she's going to be okay." I wanted to believe him. Most days I almost could. But then Grace would flinch at a sudden noise or take longer than usual to calm down, and I'd spiral into panic that Patricia had broken something fundamental in my daughter that we couldn't see yet. The supervised visitations with Marcus continued monthly, despite my objections. Each one was torture. The visitation center was a grim place in downtown Detroit, funded by grants and staffed by overworked social workers. Marcus would show up exactly on time, dressed casually in designer jeans and expensive sneakers, like this was just a normal father-daughter visit, and not supervised, court-ordered contact. He'd take Grace from my arms, and I'd see him wince slightly at the scars on her face, the ones his mother had put there. He never mentioned them, never acknowledged what had happened, just played with Grace for 2 hours while I sat in the waiting area, losing my mind. Grace would cry when she saw him, reaching back for me with desperate little hands. The social worker would note this in her report, but Marcus's lawyer would spin it as evidence that I was alienating Grace from her father. I couldn't win. If I was friendly during the exchange, I was faking. If I was cold, I was hostile. If Grace was upset, it was my fault. If she eventually warmed up to Marcus, he'd use that as proof he deserved more time with her. After each visit, Grace would be off for days. She'd wake up screaming at night, need extra comforting, be clingy and anxious. My mother would help me through it, walking the floor with Grace at 2 in the morning while I sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, wondering how this was fair or right or in any way okay. Friends from my old life slowly disappeared. Some couldn't handle the heaviness. Others believed Marcus's version, or found it easier to stay neutral. My college friend Bryn, who'd been in my wedding, sent me a text saying she couldn't be involved in family disputes, and thought I should try to work things out with Marcus for Grace's sake. I deleted her number and never spoke to her again. But I found new connections too. There was a support group for parents dealing with child abuse cases. Sitting in that circle of folding chairs, listening to other mothers and fathers describe their own nightmares, made me feel less alone. These people understood the guilt, the fear, the rage, the exhaustion. They understood how it felt to have the system work both too slowly and too fast, to face judgment from people who had never walked this path. A woman named Stephanie, whose ex-husband had broken their son's arm, became someone I could call at 3 in the morning when the panic attacks hit. A father named Marcus, ironically, had fought his own parents for custody after they'd neglected his daughter. These people became my tribe, the only ones who truly understood what this journey required. I threw myself into creating the best possible life for Grace. Despite the circumstances, I couldn't afford much, but I made our little corner of my parents' house cozy and safe. I painted the walls a soft lavender, hung curtains with clouds and stars, filled the space with books and soft toys. Grace's first word was "Mama," and I cried for an hour, relief and joy mixing together. My graphic design career had stalled during the chaos, but I slowly rebuilt it, working from home, taking on freelance projects. Money was tight, but we managed. Grace started showing her personality as she grew. This fierce little girl who loved dinosaurs and refused to wear anything that wasn't purple. She was smart and funny and completely unaware of how she'd become the center of a criminal case before she could even hold up her own head. I thought we'd moved past it. I thought the worst was behind us. Then, 5.5 years after that terrible Thursday, I got a phone call that changed everything again. It was Detective Montgomery, the same woman who had taken my initial statement. Her voice was careful, measured, as she told me that Patricia had died in prison. A medical emergency, complications from a stroke. She'd served almost 6 years of her 12-year sentence before her body gave out. She was gone. I should have felt something. Relief maybe, or closure. Instead, I just felt tired. But then Detective Montgomery said something that made my blood freeze. "Charlotte, there's something else. We've been investigating some irregularities in your ex-husband's business dealings. And during that investigation, we found something disturbing. Video files from the day of the incident, stored on Marcus's personal laptop. Files we never knew existed." My heart started pounding. What kind of video files? Marcus recorded what happened that day on his phone. The whole thing. We found the files buried in encrypted folders during our forensic search of his computers and devices. He filmed his mother burning your daughter with cigarettes. Never tried to stop her. Never called for help. Just stood there in that doorway, recording it on his phone. The room tilted. He had video evidence the entire time. During the trial, during the custody hearings, he recorded it on his phone and hid it from everyone. He encrypted the files and buried them deep in his personal storage, Detective Montgomery explained. We only found them because our tech forensics team was doing a comprehensive search related to the business fraud case. The metadata shows he recorded it the day of the incident, then moved it to hidden, encrypted folders within hours. According to his emails that we've now recovered, he was keeping it as insurance against his mother. If she ever threatened to cut him off financially or change her will, he'd have leverage. I couldn't speak. The betrayal was so deep, so profound, that I couldn't find words big enough to contain it. "There's more," the detective continued. "The footage shows his sister Veronica was actively helping Patricia. She wasn't just on her phone ignoring what was happening. She was handing Patricia the cigarettes, lighting them for her. At one point, she's visible in the frame, laughing while your daughter screamed. This wasn't just witnessing a crime or being a passive bystander. She was participating, actively assisting in the abuse. What happens now?" I managed to ask, my voice a ragged whisper. "Marcus is being charged with obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and child endangerment. Veronica is being charged as an accessory to child abuse. The prosecutor thinks they might also pursue conspiracy charges. The footage is being used to build the case. And honestly, Charlotte, it's going to destroy them both." The trials became media sensations. The footage, though heavily edited to protect Grace's identity, was leaked somehow. People across the country watched as Patricia methodically burned a 3-month-old baby, while her son filmed and her daughter assisted. The public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus's business collapsed within weeks. Clients dropped him, his partners forced him out, and his family's name became synonymous with evil. Veronica lost her job and became virtually unemployable. Both of them were convicted. Marcus got 7 years for his role in covering up the crime and obstructing justice. Veronica got 10 years for her active participation in the abuse. I attended both sentencings and gave victim impact statements that detailed exactly what they put Grace and me through. When Marcus was sentenced, he looked at me across the courtroom with so much hatred that I almost flinched. But I held his gaze, unblinking, until he looked away. He'd made his choices. Now he'd live with the consequences. The civil lawsuits came next. I sued Marcus and his family's estate for damages on Grace's behalf. With Patricia gone and having died in prison, and with both Marcus and Veronica now convicted felons facing their own prison sentences and mounting legal debts, the family fortune that had seemed untouchable was suddenly vulnerable. Marcus's father, Gerald, had died of a heart attack 2 years prior, and the estate was being divided among the remaining family members. My lawyer, the brilliant Diana Pratt, went after every asset they had. We won a judgment for $8 million, to be held in trust for Grace until she turned 18. Marcus's family home, the one his grandfather built, was sold at auction to cover the judgment. His car collection gone. His investment accounts drained. Everything that family had built over 3 generations disappeared to pay for what they'd done to my baby. I used some of the settlement money to start a foundation supporting families dealing with child abuse cases. The Grace Patterson Foundation provides legal support, therapy services, and financial assistance to parents fighting similar battles. It was the only way I could make something meaningful out of what happened to us. Grace is 6 now. The physical scars have faded to almost nothing. Just the faintest discoloration that might someday disappear completely. She doesn't remember that day. Doesn't remember her grandmother's cruelty or her father's betrayal. To her, it's just me and her grandparents in our small but fierce life in Ann Arbor. She asks about her dad sometimes. I tell her simple truths in age-appropriate ways. He made bad choices. He wasn't safe. He's not part of our lives anymore. She seems to accept this, though I know harder questions will come as she gets older. Marcus writes letters from prison occasionally, which I keep in a lockbox that Grace can read someday if she wants to. He claims he's found God, that he's sorry, that he was weak and manipulated by his mother. I don't respond. Sorry doesn't fix what he broke, and God can judge him when the time comes. Last week, Grace's school called to tell me she'd stood up to a bully who was picking on a smaller kid. She told the bully that hurting people who couldn't fight back made you a coward. The teacher said she was so fierce and certain. This tiny girl with purple shoes and dinosaur clips in her hair, defending someone who needed help. That's when I knew we'd be okay. Grace was strong, not because of what happened to her, but in spite of it. She was growing up knowing her worth, knowing that protecting the vulnerable mattered, knowing that you stand up against wrong, even when it's scary. As for me, I'm still healing. Some days are harder than others. I still have nightmares sometimes, still wake up in a panic thinking I've left Grace somewhere unsafe. But mostly, I'm proud of what we've built from the ashes of that terrible day. I protected my daughter. I fought for justice even when it cost me everything. I made sure the people who hurt her faced consequences, and I turned our suffering into something that helps others. That has to count for something. People sometimes ask if I regret anything, if I wish I'd handled things differently. My answer is always the same. The only thing I regret is trusting the wrong people. I trusted Marcus to protect his daughter. I trusted Patricia to behave like a normal human being. I trusted that family meant something to them beyond reputation and control. I won't make those mistakes again. Grace won't make those mistakes. We know now that real family isn't about blood or last names or social standing. It's about who shows up when things fall apart. It's about who protects the vulnerable and fights for what's right, even when it costs everything. Patricia died in prison. Marcus and Veronica are serving their sentences. Their family name is ruined, their fortune gone. Their legacy nothing but a cautionary tale about privilege and cruelty. Meanwhile, Grace is thriving, surrounded by people who genuinely love her, growing into exactly the kind of fierce, compassionate person the world needs more of. That's my revenge. Not the prison sentences or the financial ruin, though that certainly helped. My real revenge is that Grace is happy and safe and strong, completely untouched by their toxicity. They tried to break her before she could even speak, and instead she's flourishing. They wanted to teach her a lesson, and in the end they're the ones who learned. You don't hurt a mother's child and walk away unscathed. You don't choose reputation over an infant's safety without consequences. They gambled that their money and status would protect them from accountability, and they lost everything. I won. Grace won. And that's all that matters. Tell me, if you were in my shoes, how would you have found the strength to keep fighting? Share your thoughts in the comments below.